If you wish to know how knights survived the long winters within the stone walls of a medieval castle, then let me take you there, not as a distant observer, but as someone standing beside them, feeling the cold wind creep through the cracks and hearing the distant howl of winter storms. Imagine the first snowfall of the season. It begins softly, almost gently, covering the hills, the forests, and the narrow dirt roads that lead to the castle. At first, nothing seems threatening about it, just white flakes drifting from a gray sky. Yet everyone in the castle knows that this peaceful beginning marks the start of months of hardship, preparation, and endurance. For a knight, winter is not simply a colder season. It is an enemy, slow, silent, and inevitable. You cannot cut it with a sword. You cannot outmaneuver it on horseback. You endure it, and you endure it well, or you do not endure it at all. Inside the castle, the air turns sharper. The stone walls, so strong in battle, become merciless in winter, absorbing the cold and breathing it back into every hall and chamber. The hearths are lit earlier each day, and the great hall flickers with orange firelight that dances off shields, banners, and the polished steel of helmets hanging on wooden racks. But winter survival begins long before winter arrives. Throughout autumn, the castle becomes a hive of activity. Carts filled with grain, salted meat, dried fish, and root vegetables roll across the drawbridge. Barrels of ale and mead are stacked in storerooms so deep within the castle that even the cold cannot reach them. The knights help oversee these preparations, not because they enjoy such mundane work, but because their own survival depends on it. A knight may be a warrior, but in winter, he must also be a planner. What good is armor when hunger sets in? What good is bravery when the wind freezes the blood in your veins? And so the castle transforms. The kitchens burn constantly, boiling soups thick with barley. Blacksmiths repair tools instead of swords. Stable hands insulate the horse stalls with straw. Servants hang heavy woolen tapestries on the walls to stop drafts. And above all, everyone, from the youngest squire to the lord of the keep, listens closely to the sky. Because a harsh winter can break even a fortress, and when the first snow finally settles on the battlements, the rhythm of life changes. The training yard grows quieter. Footsteps echo differently on frozen stone. Smoke from chimneys rises in tall, straight columns into the pale sky. The world slows down, but a knight does not. A knight's duty does not disappear with the warm seasons. He must guard the castle, protect the people within it, and keep his body strong for whatever dangers winter might bring. Raiders, famine, wolves, or the dreaded sickness that spreads easily when cold locks people together indoors. So come closer to the fire. Sit with the knights in the great hall as they rub their hands near the flames, warming fingers stiffened by the chill. Let me tell you how they slept, how they trained, how they ate, how they prayed, and how they endured the long nights of a medieval winter. As the snow deepened and winter settled fully over the land, the rhythm of life inside the castle changed in ways both subtle and profound. Days grew shorter, and night crept across the sky earlier with every passing week. For a knight, this shift meant adapting, not only in his duties, but in the very way he lived each hour within the stone fortress he called home. Inside the castle walls, dawn felt different. In summer, the first light spread warm across the courtyard. In winter, it arrived pale and weak, as though even the sun struggled against the cold. When a knight awoke, he did so, wrapped in layers of wool blankets, often sleeping in a small chamber with thick walls and a single narrow window that let in more frost than sunlight. The walls were cold to the touch, and on some mornings a thin layer of ice formed on the inside of the window frame, a silent reminder of the world outside. Knights rarely slept alone during the coldest nights, not out of fear, but out of practicality. Sharing a chamber with fellow knights, squires, or men-at-arms helped preserve warmth. A room heated by multiple bodies cooled more slowly, and while it wasn't comfortable, it kept frostbite at bay. Even the highest-ranking knights understood that winter cared nothing for status. The first task of the morning was to revive the fire. In winter, a fire was not a luxury. It was survival. A knight's squire would rise early to restart the embers in the hearth, blowing gently until the flames returned to life. Warmth spread slowly through the room, but it was enough to make armor bearable to touch and clothing flexible enough to wear. Dressing for winter was a ritual of its own. Knights layered themselves carefully, linen under tunics, thick woolen garments, padded gambesons, heavy cloaks lined with fur, and boots stuffed with wool or straw for insulation. Even the proudest knight, the one who normally boasted about enduring hardship without complaint, groaned quietly as he wrapped himself against the cold. Pride did not keep one warm in January. After dressing, the knight made his way to the great hall, the heart of winter life in the castle. Here, within its high wooden-beamed ceiling, dozens of torches burned along the walls. The central hearth roared with flame, casting long shadows across the long tables where servants, squires, knights, and sometimes even the lord's family gathered to start the day. Breakfast was simple but hearty. Thick bread, often stale and dipped into hot broth, porridge of oats or barley, cured meats and smoked fish, sometimes cheese if the stores allowed it, and warm ale or weak beer, safer to drink than cold water. The heat of the food brought life back to stiff muscles. Conversations were quieter in winter, breath visible in the air, voices softened by the weight of the season. Yet there was comfort in the shared meal, the knowledge that for now they were warm, fed, and together. But winter did not excuse a knight from his duties. After breakfast, training resumed, not on the open practice field, now buried beneath snow and ice, but in covered areas within the courtyard or inside the great hall itself. Weapons training adapted to the weather. Swords grew slippery with frost, shields heavier with moisture. Knights practiced footwork on straw-covered floors, learning to balance even when the ground betrayed them. Archery practice moved indoors as well, with targets placed near distant walls and arrows collected by squires who hurried back and forth, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. When practice ended, the knights performed inspections of the walls and battlements. Even in winter, danger never slept. Raiders could strike when least expected, hoping the cold would dull a knight's vigilance. Wolves, hungry and emboldened, sometimes approached the castle outskirts in search of livestock. And the constant freeze could weaken stone structures, creating cracks that needed immediate repair before they grew into dangerous faults. So knights walked the walls every day, cloaks whipping in the icy wind, boots crunching over thin layers of frost. They checked for signs of damage, listened to the creak of wooden gates, and watched the distant horizon for movement. Nothing more than the silhouettes of trees most days, but vigilance was still required. Inside the walls, life went on. Servants hauled firewood through narrow corridors. Cooks stirred massive cauldrons that hung above roaring flames. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes and repaired armor near furnaces that glowed like captured suns in the dead of winter. Squires fetched water from partially frozen wells, carrying buckets with numb hands. For all its harshness, winter strengthened the sense of community within a castle. Everyone depended on everyone else. Knights on squires, lords on servants, soldiers on craftsmen. And though the wind howled outdoors, inside the castle one could hear laughter, singing, the crackle of fires, and the steady heartbeat of a fortress holding strong against the cold. This was a knight's winter, disciplined, uncomfortable, demanding, but warm with purpose. Winter was not only a season of cold and hunger, it was also a season of danger. You might imagine that warfare paused when snow fell and rivers froze, but that is only partly true. While full-scale battles were rare in the deepest winter months, threats never disappeared. In fact, some enemies preferred to strike in winter, hoping the cold would weaken the castle's defenses. For a knight, this meant constant vigilance. The silent watch on the battlements. On the highest walls, the wind cut like a blade. A knight standing guard atop the ramparts felt every gust as it sliced through wool, leather, and even the thickest cloaks. Fingers stiffened around spear shafts. Iron helmets grew painfully cold against the skin. Yet the watch could not be abandoned, not even for a moment. From these heights, knights stared across frozen fields and snow-covered forests, looking for anything out of place. A flicker of movement, a trail of smoke, the distant bark of dogs or wolves, or footprints breaking the smooth white surface of the snow. The world was quieter in winter, but danger echoed louder. Sometimes it was nothing, just the shifting of ice on tree branches. But sometimes it was something far worse. Winter raids, bandits, rival lords, or desperate peasants occasionally attempted small raids during the cold months. They hoped to take advantage of the castle's difficulties. Limited food, exhausted guards, slow response times. Winter made men bold when hunger clawed at them. Most raids focused on the outskirts. Livestock pens, grain storage sheds, small farmhouses just beyond the walls. Knights would saddle their horses as quickly as they could, hooves kicking snow into the air as they galloped out to defend their lands. But winter riding was treacherous. Horses slipped easily on frozen roads. Snow concealed holes, rocks, and uneven ground. One fall could break a leg for horse or rider. That is why knights often fought on foot during winter skirmishes, wearing heavy boots lined with fur and iron cleats for traction. Swords were still used, but axes and spears became more practical in slippery conditions. Even the sound of battle changed in winter. Metal rang sharper, breathing grew harsh and visible, and when the fighting ended, the red of blood on snow looked almost unreal. Too bright, too violent against the silent white world. The enemy within. Sickness. But the most dangerous enemy was not raiders or rival lords. It was sickness. Winter trapped people inside stone rooms with limited ventilation. If one person fell ill, others soon followed. Fevers spread quickly. Colds turned into infections. And knights, despite their strength, were not spared. A single winter illness could cripple a garrison more effectively than any siege engine. That is why the castle's healer, usually a monk, herbalist, or elderly woman skilled in remedies, became one of the most important people during the cold months. Honey, boiled herbs, garlic, vinegar, and steam were used to treat the sick. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. Death visited quietly in winter. Winter warfare and siege tactics. Although full sieges were uncommon during the harshest months, some strategists used winter as a weapon. If an enemy believed the castle's supplies were low, they might surround the fortress, cutting off hunters, supplies, and communication. A winter siege was often shorter than a summer one, not because defenders gave up faster, but because both sides suffered terribly from the cold. Knights prepared for such possibilities by reinforcing the gates, storing extra water in barrels so the well wouldn't freeze, checking every inch of wall for cracks, assigning nighttime patrols in pairs so no guard froze alone, keeping weapons dry and oiled, sending scouts to watch for enemy movements beyond the forests. A single mistake could doom the entire fortress. The weight of responsibility. A knight's duty was heavier in winter than in war. He had to think not only of battles, but of the entire castle's survival. Every man, woman, and child relied on the vigilance of the knightly order. Their sleepless nights, their frozen watches, their careful planning kept the castle alive. And deep down, every knight carried the same fear. What if winter is harsher than we prepared for? What if the stores run low? What if help cannot reach us? But they did not speak these fears. They simply tightened their cloaks, gripped their spears, and continued to watch the horizon. Because a knight who faltered in winter did not endanger himself. He endangered everyone behind the walls. Winter days in a medieval castle were harsh, but winter nights were something else entirely. Darkness fell early, sometimes before a knight had even finished his evening meal. Long shadows swallowed the courtyard, and torches flickered weakly in the icy wind. The castle, usually filled with movement and noise, grew quieter, not silent, but subdued. Winter brought a kind of stillness that settled over the stone like a heavy blanket. And it was in these long, cold nights that a knight's endurance was truly tested. The great hall at night, when darkness overtook the sky, most of the castle gathered in the great hall. It was the warmest place in the fortress. The fire burned there without rest, fed by thick logs of oak and pine that crackled loudly, sending sparks swirling upward. Knights sat on benches near the flames, warming their hands after hours spent outside on patrol. The great hall at night was a world of its own, the smell of roasting meat drifting from the kitchens, the murmurs of quiet conversations, the clatter of wooden cups, and the low, rhythmic hum of distant work echoing through stone corridors. Sometimes minstrels sang. Not lively summer songs, but slow melodies, tales of heroes, ancient battles, kings who built kingdoms, and warriors who never returned home. These songs warmed the spirit, even when the cold crept down from the rafters. But more often the hall echoed with a different sound, the voices of knights telling stories, stories shared by firelight. Knights told stories to stay awake, to stay sane, to stay human. Long winter months could break a man's morale as easily as a blade. Some stories were humorous, tales of clumsy squires dropping swords or falling into wells. Others were dark, memories of battles, close deaths, men lost in ambushes. Winter loosened tongues. The cold made warriors reflective. Do you think it will be a harsh winter? If the wolves come again, we'll need 3 times the guards. I heard another castle starved last year. We will not starve, not this year. Their eyes always drifted to the fire when they spoke of fear. Fire was life in winter. Training indoors. Despite the cold, knights did not abandon their discipline. The practice yard outside was often buried under snow, so training moved indoors, into barns, stables, or large storage rooms cleared for weapon practice. The muffled thud of practice swords striking wooden posts echoed late into the night. Knights drilled footwork on floors covered in straw, learning how to move when the ground was slippery or uneven, crucial skills for winter battlefields and icy skirmishes. They practiced with spears, axes, and short swords, knowing that heavy longswords became clumsy in winter gloves. Some even trained barefoot indoors, toughening their bodies, proving they could endure discomfort without complaint. The clang of metal became part of the castle's nightly heartbeat. Repairing armor and weapons. This was the season when every piece of equipment was inspected and repaired. Blacksmiths worked deep into the night, their forges glowing bright orange, casting shadows that danced on the stone walls. Knights helped too, scraping rust off helmets, sharpening blades, tightening straps, stitching torn gambesons. Winter punished metal. Moisture crept into everything. If armor was neglected, it might fail at the worst possible moment. The steady rhythm of hammers striking anvils often echoed until dawn. Prayers in the chapel. Some knights found strength not in fire or steel, but in faith. The small stone chapel of the castle glowed with candlelight each evening. Knights entered quietly, leaving their swords by the door, a symbolic act of humility. They knelt before wooden altars, breathing in incense mixed with the scent of cold stone. They prayed for warmth, for protection, for endurance. They prayed for their families far beyond the frozen fields. They prayed that winter would spare them, that hunger would not visit the castle. In that chapel, even the bravest men let their guard down. Solitude. Not every knight spent his nights among others. Some preferred solitude. A knight might walk along the empty corridors, listening to the wind groaning through the arrow slits. He might stand alone on the battlements, staring at the stars glittering above the endless white landscape. He might visit the stables to check on his horse, patting its neck, whispering to it softly, offering comfort to a creature enduring the same cold fate. Winter had a way of isolating men, even when they were surrounded by others. The stone walls felt tighter, the nights longer, the silence heavier. A knight learned to live with his thoughts, with memories of battles past, with worries about what might come. The weight of the long night. These nights shaped knights more than combat ever did. Battle tested their skill, but winter tested their spirit. A knight who survived a castle winter became harder, wiser, and more resilient. He learned patience. He learned humility. And he learned that not every enemy wore armor. Some wore frost, some wore hunger, some wore silence, and all waited outside in the dark. As winter reached its peak, a medieval castle became more than just a fortress. It turned into a fully functioning ecosystem, a small world sealed away from the dangers and cold of the outside. Every person, every room, Every resource took on a new significance, and nothing could be wasted. Inside these thick stone walls, life slowed but never stopped. Instead, it adapted. First, there were the living quarters. The Lord's chambers, although grand, were still cold by modern standards. A single fireplace could do little against the winter chill, so the room became layered with textiles, carpets piled on top of each other, woven tapestries hung from walls, heavy curtains draped around the bed. These weren't just decoration. They trapped heat, softened echoes, and blocked drafts slipping through cracks in the stone. But beyond the noble rooms, deeper in the castle, warmth was far harder to find. The servants' dormitories were packed, narrow spaces where bodies provided more heat than fireplaces. During the coldest nights, as many as a dozen people might sleep in the same room, breathing in the thick air, their snores mixing with the sound of the wind outside. Privacy was a luxury no one expected in winter. Then there were the animals, not only those meant to be eaten, but those meant to live. Horses, for example, were vital for the knight's very identity. Without a strong, healthy warhorse, a knight was not a knight at all. To keep these animals warm, stables were positioned inside the outer walls, or even connected to the main keep. The smell was strong, but the warmth they generated was worth it. Their steady breathing, their shuffling hooves. It was a reminder that life inside the castle continued, even when nature outside seemed frozen and dead. And all of this, people, animals, supplies, had to be organized like gears in a machine. A well-run castle in winter was its own living organism, and the knight, despite his status, depended on every cog. The steward oversaw the supplies. The marshal watched over the horses. The castellan ensured that every guard tower was manned. The household knights maintained order among the garrison. Each person knew their role, and in winter those roles were more critical than at any other time of year. Because one mistake, one miscounted sack of grain, one poorly maintained chimney, one unguarded gate, could lead to starvation, illness, or even an invasion. A medieval winter had no mercy. Yet inside the castle, despite the struggles, there were moments of warmth and even joy. At night, when duties were done, the great hall filled with life again. The fire roared, torches flickered, and shadows danced on the walls. Music played, stories were shared. People laughed simply because laughter kept the cold away a little longer. This contrast, the harshness outside and the fragile warmth inside, defined the winter experience for knights and common folk alike. A castle in winter was not just a residence. It was a shelter against chaos, a carefully balanced ecosystem of stone, fire, and human cooperation. And the knight, living at its center, understood better than anyone that surviving winter was not a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of discipline, planning, and the ability to endure month after month of darkness, cold, and uncertainty. But winter was not over yet, and the challenges still ahead were some of the hardest of the season. For a knight, winter inside the castle was not a season of rest. It was a season of discipline. The cold slowed the world outside, but inside the stone walls, the knight's routine remained strict, almost ritualistic, maintained to keep both body and spirit sharp during months when battlefields fell silent. The day began before sunrise, when the sky was still deep blue, and the torches burned with long, trembling flames. The knight woke in a chamber that was cold enough to see his own breath. Even with furs piled high on the bed, the moment his feet touched the floor, the cold bit like a blade. A squire would be there, usually younger, eager, and half asleep, holding a basin of warm water. It wasn't hot, firewood was too precious, but it was warm enough to wash the face and hands. The knight dressed in layers, wool first, linen over it, and sometimes a fur-lined mantle if the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. The first task of the day was prayer. Winter was a dangerous season, and knights believed survival required not only strength, but divine favor. The chapel was dim, lit by a few candles whose light seemed to struggle against the cold. The knight knelt in silence, listening to the muffled roar of wind outside, and whispered prayers for health, for endurance, and for the protection of the castle's people. After prayer came exercise. Even in winter, especially in winter, a knight had to keep his body ready. Swordsmanship wasn't practiced outdoors. The snow and ice made footing too treacherous. Instead, practice halls deep within the keep echoed with the sound of wooden wasters, training swords, clashing against shields. The knight drilled with his household soldiers, teaching, correcting, and sometimes sparring to keep his own skills honed. Strength was maintained through simple, brutal routines, lifting weighted stones, pulling rope rigs, pushing heavy wooden beams, medieval equivalents of modern gym equipment, needed not for vanity but for survival. A knight's armor could weigh over 20 kilograms, and winter cold stiffened metal, leather, and human muscles alike. After training came breakfast, though breakfast was modest compared to modern standards. Bread hardened by the cold, softened by dipping it into warm ale or broth, cheese, dried apples or pears, sometimes a bit of salted meat. The knight ate simply. Feasting was for evenings. Next came inspections. In winter, a knight had to be part warrior, part manager. He walked the battlements, checking the vigilance of the guards. Frost covered the stones, and the wind at that height was brutal, slicing through cloaks and numbing fingers. But discipline mattered most in winter. A tired guard could mean disaster, raiders, thieves, or even a surprise attack from a rival lord. He inspected the horses, ensuring their feed stores were sufficient and their coats brushed clean to prevent illness. A knight treated his war horse like a companion, sometimes better than he treated himself. Then the knight checked the armory. Winter rust was a constant enemy. Weapons needed oiling, bows needed warming so they wouldn't crack, and armor had to be kept dry, no matter how damp the air grew. By midday, when the sun reached its week highest point, the knight retreated indoors again. Meetings with the steward, the castellan, and visiting minor nobles filled the afternoon. Winter demanded planning. How long the supplies would last, which houses needed repairs, what taxes could still be collected from frozen lands. Even leisure time served a purpose. Reading, board games like chess or taffle, storytelling, all sharpened the mind, preserved strategy skills, and kept the long winter days from turning into a suffocating monotony. As evening came, the great hall awakened once more. The knight dined with the household, roasted meats if stores allowed, pottage thick with barley or beans, warm wine spiced with cinnamon if the castle was wealthy. The fire crackled loudly, as if battling the cold with its own voice. But even then, duty didn't end. Before sleep, the knight made one final round of the walls, or sent trusted men to do it. Winter nights were perilous, and vigilance could not be allowed to slip. Only then, long after darkness swallowed the world outside, did the knight return to his chamber. The bed was cold again. It always was. But exhaustion made warmth easier to find, and so ended a winter day. Not comfortable, not easy, but disciplined, structured, and purposeful. In the harshest season of the year, routine was survival. Winter inside a medieval castle was not a romantic season of snowy landscapes and warm fires. It was harsh, uncomfortable, and often dangerous, even for a knight. Stone walls did not keep out the cold as well as modern people imagine. In fact, stone absorbed the chill and radiated it inward, turning most rooms into near-freezing chambers unless a fire was constantly maintained. Let me guide you through the true hardships that a knight endured during the coldest months. The bitter cold. The first and greatest enemy was always the cold. Even deep inside the castle, the air could be so frigid that a knight's breath fogged constantly, drifting like pale smoke through the room. Condensation froze on window slits. Water left overnight turned to ice. Leather stiffened. Metal became painful to touch. Warmth was a luxury. Only the great hall, the kitchen, and the lord's private chamber usually kept fires burning day and night. Everywhere else, including most sleeping quarters, was cold enough that seeing your own breath was normal. Knights slept under layers of wool, fur, and occasionally even cloaks meant for riding. Still, waking up meant feeling every bone ache from the cold. The deep darkness. Winter days were short, and nights stretched endlessly. The castle interior remained dim even at noon. Candles and torches could not fully defeat the darkness, and the corridors often felt like tunnels of flickering shadows. For a knight, this darkness meant guard duty was harder. Enemies could approach unseen, accidents increased. Especially on icy stairs, sleep schedules shifted. People rose later and slept earlier. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost oppressive. Even those trained for war sometimes felt unease during long winter nights. In the medieval mind, darkness was not just the absence of light. It was the presence of danger, of spirits, of ill omens. Moisture and dampness. A winter castle was not dry. It was damp, painfully so. Moisture clung to everything, seeping into clothing, armor, bedding, even wooden furniture. The cold trapped the humidity inside, and fires couldn't fully absorb it. For a knight, dampness brought several problems. Rust forming on armor quicker than in summer weapons, needing constant oiling clothing. Drying slowly, sometimes never fully increased risk of illness. A knight learned quickly to keep his armor near the hearth whenever possible, even if it meant sleeping with it close enough to trip over. Illness and winter fevers. Winter was the season of sickness, feared more than battle. Inside crowded castles, cold air and poor ventilation allowed disease to spread easily. Coughs echoed through the great hall at night. Children fell ill first, servants followed. Even nights were not safe. The most common winter illnesses included fevers, lung infections, stomach sickness from spoiled winter food, rheumatism, and joint pain aggravated by cold. Medical knowledge was primitive. Herbs, prayers, and rest were the only treatments. If a knight fell ill in winter, survival was never guaranteed. The weight of monotony. The cold slowed work, travel, and communication, and with little to do outside, people were trapped together for months. The great hall echoed with the same voices, the same conversations, the same stories. Routine protected the mind, but monotony tested it. Knights often fought boredom with games of strategy, storytelling, practicing writing, for those literate, mending gear, discussing military plans. But long winters wore down even the strongest spirits. There were no campaigns, no tournaments, no travel. Only the slow passing of cold days and even colder nights. Food scarcity and hunger. Though a knight often ate better than a peasant, winter food was never abundant. Supplies had to last until spring, so meals became simple and repetitive. Salted meat, dried peas, and beans, stale bread, thick pottage, preserved fruits. If available, fresh food was rare, almost non-existent. The knight learned to live without luxury. The castle becomes a fortress. Winter also meant danger from outside. Snow slowed armies but didn't stop raids. Bandits, desperate from hunger, became bolder. Rival lords took advantage of weakened patrols. Wolves roamed closer to settlements. The knights had to stay alert. Winter sieges, though rare, were notoriously brutal. With supplies frozen and morale low, even a small enemy force could be deadly. In summary, winter was a silent war, not fought with swords, but with endurance. Cold, darkness, dampness, sickness, boredom, and hunger. These were the true enemies that tested the knight far more often than any battlefield. Surviving winter inside a castle required discipline, resilience, and a strong will. And only those who mastered their own hardship emerged into spring still standing.